I'm really happy to welcome you to the Planetary Lecture Series, Volume 3. My name is Lisa Bauer, and I'm the Interim Scientific Manager of the Panel on Planetary Thinking. The panel is a research-oriented think tank at Justus Liebig University in Giessen, and our aim is to foster holistic perspectives in sustainability-related teaching, strategy, and also in science outreach formats. The very core of our interest is in human-planet relationships and also in the manners in which we can rethink human-planet relationships. And therefore, I am really delighted that we have a really renowned speaker today for our series. His name is Bronislaw Szerszynski, and he's from Lancaster University, and he's really been a field-defining figure. Together with Nigel Clark, he co-authored the book on planetary social thought that many of you will know. And today he has brought for us, he has prepared for us a lecture performance on the topic of drift as a planetary phenomenon. And I'm really curious to watch him and to listen to what he has to say. But for now, without much further ado, please join me in welcoming Bronislaw Szerszynski.
We're in a marketplace in northern England. The stalls offer wares ranging from vegetables and fruit, cheese, bread and meat, through cooked food from various world cuisines to books, phone accessories and toys. There are bodies moving through the space between the stalls, human bodies moving singly or in groups along gradients of exchange value, use value, style and aesthetics. Like airborne dust, they move in diverse ways. Some are advected on long paths along streamlines as if towards a predetermined destination, but others drift. They're pulled this way and that along short path lengths with frequent changes of direction, like dust on a microscope. And then our eyes are caught by a moving splash of colour. A child's balloon, made of latex, filled with helium, is moving around the marketplace, floating just above the ground. The motion of the balloon seems to echo those of the people around it. It bobs up and down on its trailing string. It moves along relative to the surface of the ground below it. It seems at times purposeful, at times passive, distracted, aimless, hesitant, uncertain, pulled this way and that, by forces of attraction and repulsion. What can this drifting spectre tell us about the planet on which it has arisen? Can we see in a balloon or in other drifting things a planet in all its historical complexity and deep history? To see if we can, let us conduct an extended participatory experiment. Let's call it the drift economy experiment, guided by the hunch that attending to things that drift will allow us to recontextualize and reimagine human practices of drifting within a planetary context, can make us more sensitive to the debt that all moving things owe to the planetary mobility commons that enables their motion, and will help us discern the lineaments of a planetary ethic that extends beyond the human, beyond the animal and the living, to the whole extended body of the Earth. So to continue our experiment, let's launch a different kind of balloon, again with a latex envelope, but this time a meteorological balloon weighing 2 kilograms or so, with a payload of another kilogram consisting of cameras, power pack, black box, satellite locator, SMS tracker and parachute. Let us fill it with helium to a carefully calculated volume to give it a velocity of ascent of around 5 meters per second. Let us get all the permissions from the Civil Aviation Authority and identify a day when flight predictors say that it will not drift into restricted areas or just land in the sea. And let us launch the balloon and feel what it is like for land-bound, locomoting animals to release an entity into a world of drift. And as we watch it from the ground, our attention will seem to go with it, like that of the child on a balcony discussed by Peter Sloterdijk, who has just blown a bubble and feels he must keep watching it if its existence is to endure. But now let us take the balloon's point of view as it rises through the top of the planetary boundary layer and into the geostrophic winds of the free troposphere, the winds that know nothing of the ground below, where it will drift upwards and away. Let us track and follow it from the ground as it rises into the stratosphere, stretching larger and larger as the pressure drops, until at an altitude of 36 kilometers it bursts and releases its payload to parachute down to Earth. And let us rejoin its cargo as it enters the world of we earthbound creatures again. Let us track the payload to a suburban garden some 120 kilometers from the launch site, amongst a clutter of everyday sessile things. This exercise will tell us a lot about hitching a ride on planetary flows, about the difference between the world of drift and our world, and about where the movement of drift comes from. And now let us launch a third balloon, this time a solar sculpture as created by the Berlin-based artist Thomas Saraceno, who has designed and launched many of these balloons lifted only by sunlight, often carrying a payload of tracking and recording equipment, or sometimes even a human passenger. Let us choose a day when the sun shines onto the earth. Let's lay the envelope, an anticipatory balloon to come, on the ground. If a breeze comes, we can hold the opening so that it faces towards the wind. Or if there's no breeze, we can run around so that one way or another, the balloon to come fills with the air, inhales and then holds its breath. We can then wait as the sun warms the envelope and the enveloped air and watch this balloon rise into being and rise into the full glare of the sun so that it warms and rises into balloon existence even further. And if it gains enough lift, let it join the helium balloon rising up through the troposphere and the stratosphere, where it will level off and be carried east by the jet stream until at dusk, deprived of its solar heating, it will descend because of the breaking not of the balloon itself this time, but of the balloon's relation with the sun. We humans can also drift in our own earthbound way. Every human language seems to have words for walking without fixed purpose and for the walks that result. A few years ago, the author Robert Macfarlane asked his Twitter followers for examples of such words, resulting in a rich deposit that included the German Lustwandeln and Herumstrollen, the Hindi Tehelna, the Arabic Saha, and English vernacular words such as mosey, bimble and daunda. And many contributors offered variants of the English and Scots word stravaig, which probably derives from extravagare, a medieval Latin word meaning to wander out of bounds. But sifting through Macfarlane's word drift, it is clear that drifting is not without its politics. Drifting could be an act that comes from weakness or marginality. Witness, for example, the vagabond who wanders without a home, or the whortling of those who wander around looking for whortleberries. But drifting can also sometimes be an act of power. Mazungu, the Bantu word for white people, literally means people who wander, referencing the apparently aimless perambulations of early explorers and missionaries, and now first world tourists. Walter Benjamin's bourgeois flaneurs, strolling in the arcades of early 19th century Paris, also represent an example of drifting as luxury, here motivated by the sheer pleasure of being pulled this way and that, of seeing and being seen. But in the 20th century, the situationists gave us a new way of drifting, the urban critical practice they called the dérive. As Guy Debord explained, participants in a dérive suspend their normal, everyday attitude to the world. By allowing their bodies to be pulled this way and that, the situationists opened up human subjectivity to new ways of experiencing and occupying urban space, enabling them to map the psychogeographic contours of the city. So how can we put the dérive and drift more generally in the context of the planet? For at first sight, it seems strange that animals, such as humans, should drift. Locomotion, coordinated, deliberate motion that enables extended compound action sequences such as foraging and hunting, homing and migrating, is one of the great achievements of the animal body. Yet the flaneur and the situationist alike seem to mimic the motion of something adrift, subjected to environmental gradients and eddies, like the balloons that we launched and followed with our minds and bodies. So how can we put this apparent strategic regression into the deep time context of planetary self-organization? Let us reflect on what the motion of the various balloons we've launched and followed reveals about planetarity and the place of falling within that. For Earth, like all planets, is a falling and fallen world, a world of cadence. It is a world that falls. It circles around the sun in endless free fall. But internally too, it is fallen, and it is this condition that enables it to make other things fall. And whereas Thomas Saraceno's solar balloon rises into being, a planet falls into being. It falls thermodynamically, but also geometrically and topologically, in that from within the maternal solar cloud from which it formed, a region of undifferentiated formlessness and immanence, it collapses into a centered orb. But in space, before the planetary fall, which way is down? Which way can any cadence resolve itself, even imperfectly? Up and down, verticality, and thus the possibility of resolution of falling or rising, or of being suspended, the interrupted cadence, which is derivative of falling and rising, is neither universal nor pre-existing. Verticality is a local phenomenon, and one that is created and enacted in the planetary collapse. Collapse meaning literally a falling together. So by falling into being, a planet both makes itself and gives itself the power to make its own parts rise or fall. And once a planet has fallen into being, other powers can emerge, and one of these is the power of drift. This power is made possible by the existence of falling as an originary planetary condition, but also depends on the privation of that power, the prevention of the fall. Because within the dense, fallen, folded body of a planet, it is not really possible for an entity within a medium to fall in the strict sense as defined by Galileo as constant acceleration towards the centre of the Earth. But neither can solid bodies move totally in step with the medium that surrounds them, moving exactly along a streamline of the moving fluid and at the same rate. They have to explore the spectrum in between, and this is where the magic of drift occurs. Our three kinds of balloon and the specific ways they behave can tell us a lot about the Earth, and let's choose one balloon to focus on at first. Let's return to our child's balloon, if we can still find it. From where does it gain the power to float above the ground? The atoms of helium that lift the balloon into the air were born as alpha particles generated from the radioactive decay of uranic minerals in the Earth's crust. Then, suddenly filled with gravitational potential energy, or to use Aristotelian language, guided not so much by the efficient cause of applied force, but by the formal cause of things finding their place, they now knew which way to move in the body of the Earth, against the gravitational gradient, up through the pore space to where they pooled under the roofs of anticlines near the top of the lithosphere. And here they mingled with methane and other hydrocarbons and became entangled in a very different gradient, one between sources and sinks of energy in their technosphere, which led to them being extracted along with a natural gas, then distilled out by the energy industry before finally being allowed in and through our balloon play to find a new place in the extended body of the Earth. And finally, our balloon, filled with the helium, with its gravitational potential energy, balanced by the weight of its enclosing latex and string, wants to rise to a certain isopycnal surface, a certain altitude where the air has the right density to balance the forces of falling and rising. And then why does this balloon stravage or lustvandal so around the marketplace? As part of our experiment, Ian has taken the string attached to the balloon, but he's not pulling the balloon along. Like a good situationist, he's being pulled by it, having decided to follow the balloon wherever it wants to go. And the surface, the topos, where the balloon finds its place in the earth, is low down within the boundary layer of the atmosphere where most living creatures abide, and where the motion and the very substance of the air are a mixture of earth and sky. And in the very lowest surface layer, eddies swirl in the air that surrounds the entities, both fixed and moving, that pepper the urban surface layer. Drifting within this complex Aeolian music, the balloon is repeatedly roused from its torpor, is propelled in new directions, hesitates, reorientates, never resting in one course of action. So what are the preconditions of drift as a form of motion? Apart from the planetary condition itself, what does drift need in order to happen? First, drift needs a medium within which an object might drift. Wherever something has the potential to circulate, then drift may arise. This flow might be one of a fluid substance, a gaseous one like air, or liquid like water. Or it might be a granular flow of a substance like clastic rock, broken up and drifting down subaerial or submarine slopes. Or drift might arise in the paraflows that have emerged more recently in the Earth, streams of discrete solid entities such as transport vehicles or migrating animals that circulate around the Earth and on and in which other entities like us can hitch a ride. But second, as well as a flow, drift needs a gratuity, an opening, a withdrawal. The power of winds and rivers and subterranean flows to lift and carry particles or chemical loads, to mix and to sort, to deliver and to deposit, and thus to turn the surface and subsurface of the earth into the diverse, complex, generative regions that they are, depends on the distinction between the carrier and the carried, the medium and the message. And drift is old, a primordial power of the earth. In the warm, young, abiotic earth, before the Zoic eons when life became dominant, matter's self-organizing powers could operate without constraint, and they innovated. The innovations of drift were profound for the earth. Each of these innovations have been rediscovered again and again by other non-drifting beings. But it is in drift that these innovations come together most powerfully and consequentially for our planet. Innovation the first, the topological folding of motion within motion, of a solid moving in a moving medium, both being moved by and moving within the moving, at once two movements and one movement, a movement with an internal double articulation between carrier and carried. Innovation the second, the movement into drift, the being collected, which physicists call entrainment. Innovation the third, the movement out of drift, the being delivered and being deposited. And innovation the fourth, the mysterious passage between, of being carried and sifted and sorted. And armed by these innovations over billions of years, drift built the world that we inhabit, through the sinking and settling of chemical elements into compartments, the being carried of the continents on the liquid mantle, the settling of sediment that became the sedimentary rocks, the pushing together of tectonic plates and the driving up of mountains, and the concentrating of minerals into ores and deposits by subterranean hydrological flows. Drift is still active around us and continues its powerful but usually gentle work. Yet drift did not have the last word. With the arrival of modern animal forms in the Cambrian explosion, a radically new form of motion appeared within the earth. Locomotion, motion to a predetermined point, powered by energy stored within the moving body itself. And yet directed, powered locomotion, although hugely consequential for the planet, still represents the way that only a tiny part of the planet moves and occupies space and does its work. But we still seem to think and act as if we motile animals should be the measure of all things, so that anything that does not move under its own steam is seen to suffer from some kind of metaphysical privation. But if any form of motion should be the unmarked category, so that all others are merely derivative, it should be drift. We need to value drift more and understand it better. And such a transvaluation can help us better understand the nature of all motion. But why is it so hard to comprehend drift? How have we forgotten so much since our forebears drifted? What turbulence and turbidity has clouded our vision so that we cannot even clearly conceive what drift is? There are clues in the very way that we talk about it. In English, the words drift and cast can mean both the motion and the result of that motion. We say that the snow or leaves drift, but also talk about the resulting drift of leaves or snow. Likewise, cast refers both to the throw itself and also the result of the throw, the cast of a fishing line or molten metal or of a play. And this ambiguity gives us a clue to the secret primordial magic of drift. European languages tend to divide the world sharply into active and passive, agent and patient. So in English, when talking about snowdrifts, we might use the active voice formulation, the wind moves or pushes or lifts or drives or carries the snow. Or we might use the passive voice version, the snow is moved or pushed or lifted or carried or driven by the wind. But in both it seems to be clear what is driving what is active and what is passive, as if the drift is merely the end product of the driving wind, the cast the end product of the casting. And note that the active voice, grounded in the experience of animal motion, assumes that an actor can be in a sense outside the action, controlling it and not changed by it. This is surely the grammar behind the idea of the seemingly detached observer of modern science, the distanced actor of technology, and the environment seen as a mere passive resource or instrument for human will. But what planetary realities does that language occlude? How much of our difficulty in understanding drift comes from the very language we use to describe motion and cause and effect? And yet our language can also give us telltale signs that can jog us into anamnesis, into recalling the primacy of drift. Drift has its own semantics, its own special words, but more importantly, it also has its own grammar, its own syntax that draws us to use the middle voice that many other languages have. In drifting or floating or straying or diverting, the subject does not simply either do something or have something done to them. In these motions, agency is not clearly located in one entity, in contrast to another, or in the entity as opposed to its environment. Modern English grammar lacks a proper middle voice, yet we seem to be compelled to reinvent it. One ancient Proto-Indo-European linguistic root gave us both the English active voice drive and the middle voice drift. Another root, both the active verb fly and the middle voice float. And the French word for drift, dérivé, can also be active, passive and middle. And if a body is really à la dérive, drifting, on the loose, extravagant, then surely we need to talk about it in the middle voice. So suspension and drift can summon up the middle voice in us, and the middle voice can allow us to give voice to drift. Locomotion encourages us to make a division between the active animal and its passive environment. Drift as a way of being and thinking divides and joins the world differently. In drift, we are not driving, but neither are we being driven. And although in drift there is a division between the air and the balloon, the carrier and the carried, and the medium and the message, the resulting motion is a single motion, one which results from the immersion of the body in the medium and is the conjoined achievement of all. However, that does not mean that drift is always enclosed with no meaning outside its own wandering. The situationist dérive is not purely autotelic, with no purpose outside itself. Despite the situationist slogan, never work, the dérive can be seen as a form of what I call driftwork, drift being put to work, in this case, in service of the psychogeographic mapping of a city. Does this somehow violate the spirit of drift? I think not. To think that this is the case, that drift, the following of ambient gradients, can have no purpose outside itself, will be once again to fall into the bias against drift that is an inheritance of our animal bodies and our active voice thinking. From the point of view of locomoting creatures like ourselves, drift is a form of motion that has two key features. One, it only uses ambient gradients as its sources of energy, and two, it results in undirected motion. It is, of course, possible for animals to drift in this full paradigmatic sense. Indeed, animals such as jellyfish with the radially symmetrical body plans of the Ediacaran period typically do this, as do resting motile animals in water or the ballooning spiders in the air, so loved by Thomas Saraceno. But animals, including humans, can also exploit drift in a partial, one might say derivative way. And even non-living entities and systems can engage in what we might call driftwork, in which drift is subsumed within a wider set of purposes or functions. We have seen that from the earliest eons of the Earth, drift has been engaged in work, building the structures of the world and maintaining them in the far from equilibrium state that enables them to generate new phenomena. But at all temporal and spatial scales, different kinds of drift work are at play around us that I call sorting, shifting, soaring, and surging. Firstly, sorting occurs in the paradigm form of pure drift, in which the suspended body is given over to the play between it and the enveloping substance. In sorting, order is produced out of the differential drifting of many bodies in the same medium. Drifting things of different shapes and sizes and weights are separated by their motion through the enveloping medium into separate species of things adrift, which move in quite different ways. And this power of separation gives drift a cunning that sorts and delivers. Different kinds of drifting things arrive at different destinations or at different times and then sedimented on top of each other, a dynamic exploited in many processes of structure creation in the Earth, not just geological, but also genetic, social, cultural, and political. And secondly, shifting is a form of drift work that is done not by the action of drift itself, but by the entities that launch bodies or themselves into drift, and involves moving the launch bodies up and down the different scale-related mobility zones of the air. Here, entities are drifting in the paradigmatic sense, subjecting themselves to the power of drift to sort and deliver, but their insertion into the sorting process is altered in advance. And plants have evolved many ways to move their seeds up the scale-related mobility zones, giving rise to asymmetrical auto-rotating seeds and bilaterally symmetrical winged seeds that do not endlessly accelerate in their fall, but find a terminal velocity. Or fluffy papose seeds that can then imitate the tiniest particles of the air and stay suspended almost indefinitely. Humans, with their large bodies, can only move up the scale-related mobility zones of the air in this way when suspended by a balloon. The envelope above us does not just make us feel small in comparison, but also enables us to move like small things, almost along with the air around us, and feel stillness in motion. Thirdly, in soaring, entities shape their bodies to take control of drift and bend it to their purposes. In soaring, a body modulates the drift process in a dynamic way by choosing when and where to enter drift, and or by reorienting its body so that it crosses the streamlines of the enveloping fluid in a controlled way, usually in order to subordinate drift to directed motion. Trees such as silver birch time the launch of their tiny gliding seeds by embedding them in catkins that only disintegrate at the right season and in a sufficiently powerful gust of wind to take them far from the tree. And birds know when to enter and leave particular air currents that allow them to save energy by soaring, gaining lift from rising air produced by thermals, weather fronts or slopes, or using dynamic soaring in a looping trajectory to extract power from differences in wind speed at different heights. And there is a politics, too, in the dynamic between sorting and soaring, one that complicates our earlier discussion of the politics of drift and power. For who, in the end, is more free, the driver or the drifter? It depends on your point of view. Consider the streamlines of fluid motion. A streamline is defined as a line that is everywhere parallel to the local velocity vector of the medium. Streamlines can, by definition, never cross or meet or diverge. The flow must, by definition, follow the streamlines. And drivers are bound to the streamlines leading to their destination. They are in effect being sorted. And now think about a drifting entity that can enter and leave the flow and move across the streamlines. So perhaps the drifters, the hitchhikers, the vagrants, the hobos hopping on and off freight trains, it is them who really have the capacity to soar free, are actually more free than the drivers. And then finally, surging involves another form of driftwork, a modulation of the powers of drift, not by individual bodies, but by multiple drifting bodies acting in concert, such that the motion of the fluid medium is itself shaped by the bodies moving through it, producing not ordered, hierarchical structures, but dynamic, unfolding, insurrectionary phenomena that use drift against itself, not to sort, but to resist sorting. And even in non-living processes, such as turbidity flows, drifting things can conspire together in this way to take control of their drift through surging. In submarine rock avalanches, such as those that occur on the edge of continental shelves, as the turbidity flow accelerates down the slope, it picks up more and more sediment in a runaway dynamic and can develop a structured animal-like body divided into regions with different properties, in which the individual rock particles develop an evolving self-sustaining division of labour. Such turbidity flows can continue for thousands of miles across the abyssal plain. In this dense and folded planetary world we inhabit, how might we give space for, draw closer to, and draw sustenance from the endlessly renewable primordial power of drift? Motivated by such questions, I carried out the drift economy experiment in Lancaster in 2017 with Sasha Engelman and Adam Fish. Transport systems, we thought, are pushing Earth systems beyond endurance, but also profoundly shape the way that human society is organised, where we live, how we meet our needs, our institutions, our desires and our expectations. As well as launching balloons and other entities into drift, we asked people to imagine a radically different mobility system, one in which we have learned how to utilise the kinds of motion employed by the abiotic but still animate parts of the Earth, in which moving things that inhabit and build and cohere the Earth are powered not by chemical energy stored internally as sugars or fats or fuel or batteries, but solely by ambient energy, the energy that surrounds an object due to its specific location in the flows and gradients of the Earth system. But we found that thinking about drift with all these people inevitably drew us into deeper questions about how we live and should live on a more than human planet. And one conclusion from our experiment, already prefigured in its name, is that drift is gift, and this in many senses. Firstly, of course, drift is motion that is gifted to drifting things in the moment by the very arrangement of the planet around them, a blessed share of motion given immediately without any expectation of return, an action without an equal and opposite reaction. And we should learn to use this gift of drift more, learn from those in society who already hold relevant head knowledge and body knowledge about how to use the environment around them to drift. Sailors, ballooners, downhill skiers, surfers, migrants, even hitchhikers and commuters. But to make a real drift economy, we would also need to develop a far deeper understanding of the more than human world around us and the processes of drift that abound in it. And we need to learn how to use drift in drift work without taming it, without subordinating it to our active voice tendencies, to drift in the middle voice, open to the play of bodies in the medium, to the cunning of drift, to the cognitive power of elemental processes, to sift and sort and surprise. And drift is also a deep time gift given to moving things by the long, patient drift work of planetary evolution over deep time that has created a world shot through with gradients and gratuities, a world that is thus generative and creative, a storehouse of experiments and potentiality and beauty. The planetary commons to which we are in existential debt is thus not just the actual arrangement of the world we see and feel around us, but an ongoing open-ended process of creative emergence. And drift, if we can only recognize it and appreciate it, is also an epistemic gift. Drift is both a distinctive form of motion and helps us see the preconditions of all motion. Locomoting bodies, whether animal or machine, can also only move because of the planet of which they are a part. But in locomotion, this dependency is convoluted and concealed. Drift, by contrast, is honest, patent, plain speaking, a revelation perhaps. For drift shouts out that all our powers are powers that we owe to the generosity of Earth's planetary commons. And drift, when we recognize it for what it is and what it reveals, also contains an ethical imperative, one that should draw forth from us acts of solidarity towards the other entities with which we share our planet. Drift relies on a gratuity and arbitrariness between carrier and carried, medium and load. And drifting things travel without possessions, without power, without a destination. Drift thus tells us that our powers and our luck are not ours alone, that what we have and where we landed, our possessions and our home, do not in any fundamental sense belong to us alone. Drift takes John Rawls's veil of ignorance and turns it from a thought experiment into a material, embodied planetary process. How would we want society to be organized if the movement of people and goods took the form of dissemination by drift? We need a socio-ecological theory of drift, one that asks not how drift can be eradicated, but how the world can be made safe, hospitable, and just for drifting beings. Floating knows what flight has forgotten, that motion cannot fully be understood in the active voice, that action is always a collaboration between the compartments of the fallen and falling world, themselves open to the cosmic gift of light. So many thoughts, all lofted by a child's balloon. Thank you.